Last time on, the knife. Lori Masters, a student volunteer at Shadyside Hospital, has finally been transferred from the orthopedic floor to the children's floor. While delivering some x-rays, she ran into her friend Sky Keeley, who was carrying balloons to a patient in room 901. As Lori and Sky talked, a senior nurse, Edith Wilton, walked by and scolded the two girls for standing around talking. Before returning to their work, Sky asked Lori to meet her in the cafeteria at lunchtime. Just as Lori was about to walk away, a soft, pitiful whimpering caught her attention. It was coming from room 903 across the hall. She entered the room to find a small child crying in his bed. Lori tried to comfort the boy, but he wouldn't speak to her. She checked his charts. The boy's name was Toby Dean. He was 3 years old, and he was in the hospital for pneumonia. Lori continued to comfort the little boy as she gently talked to him and held his hand. Suddenly, the door abruptly opened, and Nurse Wilton burst into the room, asking Lori what she was doing in there. She explained to the nurse that she was only trying to comfort Toby, but with a nasty attitude, Nurse Wilton told her that she was wasting her time and told Lori to leave the room. As she left the room, she glanced back at the boy one last time and saw a look in his eyes as if he was pleading with her. During lunch, Lori told Sky about little Toby and asked if she could borrow a couple of balloons from room 901. As they continued to talk, an attractive young man entered the cafeteria and caught Sky and Lori's attention. He introduced himself as Rick Spencer and sat down at the table. He told him that he was a med student working on the surgical floor. Rick seemed to be showing interest in Lori as they talked. Eventually, an announcement blared out over the intercom, and Lori's mouth dropped open when she heard them calling a code blue in room 903. That code meant that there was a terrible emergency. Lori jumped up from the table and rushed to Toby's room. When she came into the room, she saw the boy thrashing and screaming, trying to push Nurse Wilton away, who was holding a hypodermic needle in her hand. Lori discovered that it was room 503 that had a code blue, not 903. She offered to help Nurse Wilton draw blood from Toby. She offered to talk to him and keep him calm, but the grouchy nurse claimed she didn't need any help and told Lori to stay out of her way and leave the room. After she left the room, she decided to go to the nurse's station and ask Nurse Jenny Gerard if there was any way she could help Toby without having Nurse Wilton coming down on her. But when Lori walked up to the station, she saw Nurse Gerard speaking with a seemingly agitated woman. As Lori overheard the conversation, she realized that the woman was Miss Stine, Toby's mother. She seemed very impatient to take the boy home, but Nurse Gerard told her that the doctors won't release him until they know that he is fully recovered, but that he could possibly be going home as soon as tomorrow. Lori watched as Miss Dean got on the elevator and left the children's floor. Then she noticed Nurse Wilton walking down the hall away from Toby's room. She decided that now was her chance to talk to him again. She slipped back into Toby's room. She gave him the good news that she had just overheard, that he could finally be going home tomorrow. The child still didn't speak to her, but gave her a smile at the good news. Lori sat beside him and held his hand until he fell asleep. As Lori crept out of his room, she caught a glimpse of the entrance to the new Franklin Fear Wing, which was still under construction. She thought she had seen the entrance door slowly close, as if someone was spying on her or watching Toby's room. As she started to walk away, she glanced back at the construction door and saw a man getting ready to step out, but quickly stepped back inside. It was only a quick glance, but Lori recognized him. It was Rick Spencer. What was he doing in the construction area after hours? Later that evening, Lori sat at home waiting on her Aunt Hillary. It was getting very late. Hillary worked as a bank consultant, which sometimes put her going out of town or working late nights. Eventually, the phone rang, and Lori answered it. No one spoke on the other end, but she could hear heavy breathing, and just before hanging up, she heard the faint sound of an ambulance siren in the background. A few minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, it was Rick Spencer. Lori asked him how he got her number. He told her that Sky had given it to him. Lori wondered why Sky hadn't mentioned giving him her number. He asked her why she rushed out of the cafeteria at lunch. She told him about Toby and that it was only a false alarm. Then, she remembered seeing him coming out of the Franklin Fear Wing. She asked him if he was on the children's floor that afternoon, but Rick denied it. He then tried to ask her if she'd like to go out sometime since he was new in town, but Lori declined. She then told him that she had to get off the phone and that she would see him tomorrow at the hospital. Just before hanging up the phone, she heard the wail of a siren in the background again. She wondered if it had been Rick who called her the first time, and if so, what was he doing at the hospital so late? She decided to give Sky a quick call, even though she knew it was late. She asked her if she had given Rick her number. When Sky told her no, Lori realized one thing right then. Rick Spencer was a liar. The next morning, just as Lori was about to leave for the hospital, the phone rang, and it was Andy, Lori's boyfriend, and the son of Dr. Price, the owner of the Shadyside Hospital. He asked her to join him for pizza after work, along with Sky and Jim Farrow. Lori agreed and quickly got off the phone. She hurried to the hospital and made her way to the gift shop. She was looking for a gift for Toby, something to cheer him up. She chose a fluffy little teddy bear and began making her way to his room. She eagerly entered, but was only greeted by a bare, empty room. She began to make her way to the nurse's station to find out what had happened to him. To her relief, she saw him at the station with his mother. Then she noticed that Miss Stine was in a deep conversation with Rick Spencer. Again, she wondered what he was doing on the children's floor. When Toby noticed her, she held out the teddy bear to him. He slipped out of Miss Stine's grasp and walked shyly up to Lori. He took the teddy bear from her and hugged it affectionately. Lori told him that she was going to miss him, but she was happy that he was finally going home. Lori asked for a final goodbye, just one word from him, but he shook his head. She bent down and gave him a hug, then turned him towards his mother and told him that his mommy was waiting on him. Toby turned back to Lori and finally spoke his first words to her. He looked at her and said, "She's not my mommy." Chapter 7. Lori leaned closer to Toby. "What do you mean? Of course she's your mommy." Toby shook his head. "No, she's not." "Toby, come here this minute," Miss Dean called, but Rick said something to her just then and distracted her. "Who is she then?" Lori asked. She wondered if Toby was still sick and imagining things. "I'm not supposed to say. She'll be mad if I do." "Who will be mad? Who is she?" Toby hung his head. "I want to go home," he snuffled. "Toby, I said come here, right now," Miss Dean called sharply. Both she and Rick were staring at Lori and the child. Dragging his feet, Toby returned to the nurse's station. Lori could see Miss Dean questioning him about the teddy bear, which Toby clutched even tighter. Rick and the woman glanced down the hall at Lori. Then Miss Dean took Toby's hand and pulled him toward the elevators. Just before he stepped inside, Toby gave Lori one last pleading look. Lori hurried to the nurse's station to talk to Rick. He had pulled on his tan tunic and was smoothing his hair when she reached him. "What are you doing on this floor?" Lori asked. "One of the doctors sent me on an errand. Hey, that was really nice of you to get that kid a toy. Toby Dean. Is he the one you were worrying about yesterday?" "Uh-huh," Lori said. "That woman you were talking to, she's his mother, right?" "Right," Rick said. "They're new in Shadyside. Just moved into an old house on Fear Street, she told me. I was telling her where the nearest pharmacy is so she could fill a prescription for Toby. I'm glad I ran into you." "Me too," Lori said, planning her next words to sound casual. "I was wondering why you were at the hospital so late last night. Have they started night shifts for the volunteers?" Rick seemed surprised. "What makes you think I was here? Weren't you?" "Nope." He hesitated. "I was hoping I'd see you here because I wanted to ask if you were free after work today. I thought maybe you'd like to show a stranger around town." His dark blue eyes fixed on hers. He smiled, and Lori had to remind herself that she couldn't trust him any farther than she could throw him. He was at the hospital the night before. She was sure of it. And how could he have directed Miss Dean to a pharmacy? He was new in Shadyside himself, he said. He certainly was laying on the charm, though, and he certainly was sure of himself. "Is it a date?" he asked, touching her sleeve. "I can't. I'm meeting someone." The phone at the nurse's station rang, saving her from having to explain any further. No nurse was in sight. Lori leaned over the high ledge of the station to the desk below it where the phone kept up its jangling. She reached to answer it, but pulled back her hand in alarm. On the desk next to the phone was a long rectangular box, its lid open, displaying its frightening contents. 3 long surgical knives lay in the fitted case, the light sparkling on their razor-sharp blades. Lori stared at them, almost hypnotized. The phone continued to ring. "I'll get it," Rick said, reaching around her. She backed away and let him answer the call. She couldn't understand why she had been so overcome with terror. Those knives were instruments of healing, designed to help the sick, not to cause pain or injury. Why had they filled her with horror? "I'm too jumpy," she thought as she made her way back to Toby's room to pick up her bag and tunic. The little boy's words haunted her. Why did he say Miss Dean wasn't his mother? Was there something seriously wrong with Toby? When she returned to the hall, she watched as Rick finished writing a note and hung up the phone. Then she saw him pick up the box of surgical knives, close it, and slip it into the pocket of his tunic as he walked to the elevators. Chapter 8. Rick stole those knives. Lori couldn't believe her eyes. She stared at the elevator door that had just closed behind him, wondering what to do. She ought to tell someone, but whom? And did she really want to get Rick into serious trouble? He's a thief, as well as a liar, a small voice in her head reminded her. She went to the nurse's station and stood there, scowling in confusion. A loud clatter from the service elevator around the corner startled her. A troop of workmen erupted into the hallway. They were so noisy and distracting as they marched down the hall to the fear wing that Lori didn't even notice Nurse Jenny Gerard return to her desk. When the phone rang and Lori turned to answer it, she was surprised to see Nurse Gerard pick up the receiver. Nurse Gerard, she thought. Maybe I should mention the knives to her. The tall, dark-haired nurse was laughing into the phone. What? More? I don't believe it. Okay, I'll send someone to pick it up. There's a volunteer standing here right now. She hung up, shaking her head in amusement. Lori started to tell her about the knives. I wonder, did you see those? But the nurse interrupted her. Lori, would you be a doll, please? There's a package down at reception for room 901. Another one? They're going to need a truck to take that kid and his toys home. Would you go pick it up? That was the first of dozens of errands that kept Lori running all day. Everywhere she went, though, she couldn't stop thinking about Toby, about what he had said. Rick all but forgotten now. Toby's small, sad, frightened face floated in front of her as she delivered packages and x-rays, read to patients, and helped the nurses. She was haunted by him. By the end of the day, Lori had made up her mind. Toby Dean was in trouble. He needed her help. She had to do something. Patients' records were stored in a small office at the back of the nurses' station. No one was allowed in there except doctors and nurses. Lori would be taking a terrible chance, but she was determined to see Toby again. After work, when the nurses' shifts were changing, and when the workmen from the fear wing were all leaving for the day, Lori took advantage of the confusion to sneak into the office. Inside, it was cramped and dusty, and smelled of old paper. She felt claustrophobic in the tiny space. Her fingers trembling, she flipped through the records until she found Toby's. He did live on Fear Street, as Rick had said. Fear Street was the last place on earth Lori would want to go to. The very name filled her with dread. But if she didn't go to Toby's house, she'd never see him again. As she made a note of Toby's address, she realized that she needed some kind of excuse to visit him. She couldn't just ring the doorbell and say she had come to see Toby. Miss Stine hadn't looked at all friendly. Lori needed a reason, something convincing. But what? She racked her brain for an answer. Then it struck her. The raffle. She was selling tickets for the hospital raffle for the Mercedes-Benz. Miss Stine must have seen the car on her way in and out of the hospital. Lori could go to Toby's house on the pretext of selling Miss Stine a ticket. It would be simple. Except, did Lori really want to go to Fear Street alone? She glanced at her watch and remembered she was supposed to meet Andy at Patsy's Pizzeria. Andy and Sky and Jim Farrow. Why not ask them to go with her to Fear Street? It shouldn't be too hard to convince one of them, at least. Satisfied that she had just solved several problems at once, Lori returned Toby's records to the files and cracked open the door of the cramped office. A voice floated in from the nurse's station through the opening. Oh, Edith, I've been looking for you. New orders for the patient in 908. Would you come here, please? Cora Marshall, the head nurse on the children's floor, was standing with her back to the office door, calling to someone out of sight. Nurse Edith Wilton stepped up to the front desk. Lori inched the door almost shut again and stood in the dark, trembling. Of all the people to catch her, Nurse Wilton would be the absolute worst. Lori peeped out and watched the two nurses confer. She was almost frantic as she waited for her chance to escape. It seemed an eternity before Nurse Marshall left. Any minute now, Wilton would leave too, Lori thought. But Nurse Wilton settled in the desk chair and began to go over some charts. Lori fidgeted desperately. The small office became even tinier and warmer. She clenched her fists to calm herself. She thought she would explode. Nurse Wilton turned a page in the charts, and a sheet of paper fell to the floor. She bent to pick it up. Her head was now below the desk. Without thinking, Lori darted out of the office, past the desk, and down the hall, but not fast enough. Just a minute, young lady, Nurse Wilton called. What were you doing in there? Lori kept going. I saw you, Lori, the nurse shouted. Come back here. Lori swerved to avoid a young patient in a bathrobe who was strolling in the hall. She skidded around the first corner. She was out of sight, but she could still hear Nurse Wilton's squishy shoes squeaking down the hall after her. Dead end. Lori came to a full stop at the door to the service elevator. It was only used to transport heavy equipment and patients on gurneys. No other traffic was allowed, but there was no other place for Lori to go, except straight into Nurse Wilton's arms. She jabbed at the elevator button, whispering, Hurry, Please. The door slid open, and Lori stepped inside, just as Nurse Wilton rounded the corner. Wait! The furious nurse called. The door slid shut, and the elevator began to move slowly downward. Lori sighed with relief, took a step back, and bumped into a gurney. She wheeled around and looked down in horror. Lying on the rolling table was a waxen-faced woman, her eyes closed. Monitoring machines whirred and beeped nervously at her feet. Intravenous bottles hung from poles over the gurney, with tubes leading into the woman's body somewhere beneath the blanket. The bottles had started jiggling and clicking when Lori hit the table. Watch it, the orderly escorting the patient growled. You're not supposed to be here. His hand gripped Lori's shoulder, and she gasped. He pushed a button on the elevator panel and ordered her. Out. You're getting off at the next floor. With pleasure, Lori thought. She glanced down at the patient on the gurney. She must be dead. Suddenly, the woman's eyes snapped open. She fixed Lori with a terrible stare and moaned softly. Lori pressed herself against the elevator wall. When the elevator crawled to a stop, Lori flung herself out through the open door. She didn't know where she was, and she didn't care. Then she saw the sign opposite the elevator door. This floor restricted. Authorized personnel only. The elevator doors closed, and Lori was alone. She looked around. The hall was quite dark. The whole floor was quiet and seemed to be deserted. Lori had never been on this floor before. It didn't look like an ordinary medical ward. Where was she, and how was she going to get out? She was confused and a little afraid to move away from the service elevator. She might get lost in the unfamiliar corridor. The rumbling and clanking of the elevator's gears startled her, and she looked up at the floor indicator. It had stopped at the 9th floor. The elevator must have dropped off its patient and returned to the children's floor. Nurse Wilton, Lori thought. She would have seen the indicator stop when Lori got off. She knew where Lori was. She'd be coming to get her. Lori had no choice. She had to get away. She started down the dark hall, desperately trying each door as she passed. They were all locked. She didn't know if she was heading for the passenger elevators or away from them. She could end up at another dead end, trapped. Suddenly, as she went around a corner, she spied something crouched at the end of the corridor. Something small. It wasn't moving. She squinted hard into the shadows and almost laughed. It was a cleaning bucket and a mop outside the last door. If an orderly was in there, he could tell her how to get out. He might scream at her for being on a restricted floor, but she didn't care, just as long as he helped her get away from Nurse Wilton. She rushed down the hall to the bucket, expecting to see a rectangle of light shining around the last door. But it, too, was dark. The orderly must have taken a break. He'd be back, Lori reasoned, but she couldn't stand out in the corridor waiting for Nurse Wilton to catch her. She tried the doorknob. The door was open. Lori ducked inside and stopped to catch her breath. The room was very cold, and she began to shiver in her light hospital tunic. A strange smell stung her nostrils. An overpowering chemical odor filled the air. The dark was almost as suffocating as the odor. Gradually, she could make out several banks of high metal tables. She started to feel her way around the room, touching the cold metal of the tables as she went. An unexpected puddle of water made her slip, and she reached out to steady herself against falling. Her hand grasped something on a table. Something. Round. Freezing. Familiar. She was clutching the cold, clammy shoulder of a corpse. Chapter 9. Lori's hands flew up as she recoiled in panic. A corpse on the table, and she had touched it. She backed away and started to gag. Then in a flash, she knew where she was. That acrid chemical smell in the air must be formaldehyde, used to preserve and disinfect dead bodies. The floor she had stumbled onto was dark and empty because it was part of the medical school, and classes were over for the day. This room must be the anatomy lab, where students dissected and studied the human body. The dead human body. Her eyes adjusted to the dark. Lori began to see the grisly forms of partially dissected corpses and body parts on the tables. She wheeled around and started toward the door, panting in horror. Just then, she heard footsteps outside, followed by the jangling of keys and a bucket clanking as it was taken away from the door and down the corridor. She was locked in. An animal-like howl escaped from deep in her throat. She flung herself toward the locked door, only to crash into something white and gleaming that clattered as she touched it. A dangling white skeleton danced before her, one bony arm wrapping itself around her neck. She leaped backward, reaching out to keep her balance, and found that she had grabbed an icy hand. a hand that ended at the wrist. Whirling around, she came face to face with a severed head propped up on a shelf. Its eyes were closed, its mouth was gaping, and its scalp had been partially peeled back. Lori tried to cry out, but her terror choked in her throat. She flew to the door, rattling the doorknob, slamming her fist against the solid wood. She didn't care if Nurse Wilton found her. She had to get out of this ghastly room, away from the bodies, the parts of bodies. She pounded frantically, but nobody was there to hear. She leaned her forehead against the door for a minute. Then she had a sickening new feeling. Something in the room behind her was moving. Chapter 10. Lori spun around to face the terrible thing that was coming at her. She scanned the dark room, tears filling her eyes. Her breathing was loud in her ears. Where was it? What was it? The room was perfectly still. Nothing was moving toward her. The dark shapes of the tables, each with its grisly burden, lurked silently, unmoving. She realized that she had become hysterical with terror. She was imagining things. Nothing in the room was alive and stirring, except for her. With that moment of clarity, she realized something. The door may have needed a key to lock from the outside, but she should be able to unlock it from the inside. She turned back to the door. Her hand trembling, she felt for the doorknob and twisted it. The lock held fast. Her fingers swept around the doorknob, probably for the latch bolt. There it was, a knob of metal protruding from the door just above the knob. She tried turning it to the left. Nothing. To the right. There was a metallic clunk, and the catch released. In her haste to escape, Lori nearly stumbled over her own feet. She didn't bother closing the lab door behind her. She just flew down the hall, gulping in deep breaths of untainted air as she ran. Rounding the curve of the long corridor, she braked to a sudden stop. Nurse Wilton was standing at the service elevator, her back to the hall. She wasn't alone. The tall man with her had gray hair and was wearing a white lab coat. He wasn't a security guard, Lori knew, because they wore blue uniforms. From the back, he seemed familiar to Lori. Had Nurse Wilton called a doctor to help her chase Lori? She backed up against the wall and inched around the curve, praying that they hadn't seen her. Their conversation floated down the hall, but Lori couldn't hear what they were saying, only that Nurse Wilton sounded very upset. Just as the elevator doors opened, Lori thought she knew who the man was. He looked very much like Andy's father, Dr. Raymond Price. Impossible. Nurse Wilton wouldn't call the head of Shadyside Hospital to complain about a student volunteer, not unless she was crazy. Lori knew she must be mistaken. Right now, she had other things to worry about, like how to get out. As soon as the elevator door closed on the man and Nurse Wilton, Lori took off to find the passenger elevators. Once she was out of the hospital and behind the wheel of her car in the parking lot, it took a long time before she could stop shaking enough to drive to Patsy's Pizzeria. "You got locked in where?" Skye asked, as she picked a piece of pepperoni off her pizza and popped it into her mouth. She stared in amazement at Lori, then at Andy, who were both seated across the table from her. Patsy's Pizzeria was jammed, as usual. Since it was near Shadyside Hospital, most of the people who went there were on the hospital staff and knew one another. Talking between the tables raised the decibels almost to the level of the hospital cafeteria. "Listen to this," Skye said to Jim Farrow as he sat his oily paper plate of pizza down on the table and sat next to her. "Lori was locked inside the anatomy lab." "It was a nightmare," Lori said, shuddering. "Pieces of bodies and heads and skeletons." "All dripping with slime, I bet," Andy said. He picked up his cheesy slice and let the yellow and red ooze onto his plate. "Just like this." "Come on, man, I'm trying to eat," Jim groaned. He shook his blonde head and took a bite of his slice. "I'd rather touch a corpse than eat those anchovies," Skye said, and turned back to Lori. "How did you get out? And what were you doing in the anatomy lab anyhow?" Lori was suddenly reluctant to tell them that she had been chased there by a nurse who had caught her where she wasn't supposed to be. I got off the elevator on the wrong floor." She shrugged it off, eager to change the subject. "Listen, are any of you free later? I've got an errand to run, and I could use some company." Between bites of pizza, she told them about Toby Dean. Not everything, just that he seemed sad and lonely, and she wanted to visit him. She pulled the booklets of raffle tickets out of her bag and explained that she was going to use them as an excuse to drop by Toby's house. "I was going to go there right away. if any of you wanted to come along." "Oh, that does sound like a thrill," Andy exclaimed sarcastically. "It might be too exciting for me." Lori tried to hide her embarrassment. "Well, the house is on Fear Street, and Jim laughed. "And you want someone to hold your hand?" "Don't laugh at her, Pharaoh," Sky said scornfully. "You were the one who told everyone that story about being chased by something the size of a bear through the Fear Street woods." "It wouldn't stop me from going again, though," Jim protested. "Okay, we'll all go," Sky decided. "Great," Andy said sarcastically. He wiped his hands carefully, then ran them through his thick dark hair. He looked glum. "Can't we think of anything better to do?" "If you don't want to come," Lori snapped. Okay, I'll go," Andy said moodily. Thoughts of Fear Street in the dark of night sobered them as they made their way out of the pizzeria a little later and piled into Andy's Volvo. So many frightening stories had been told about this street that wound past the cemetery and through the thick Fear Street woods. Stories that most often turned out to be true. By the time the four friends turned onto Fear Street, they were all quiet and deadly serious. "Do you have the address?" Jim asked Lori, leaning over the back seat of the car. Lori was staring out the window. In the early evening light, Fear Street didn't look particularly terrifying, but there was a stillness that was unnatural. A heavy silence surrounded them as they drove slowly along the curving road. Lori was so transfixed that she jumped when Jim touched her shoulder. "The address?" he repeated. "Oh, yes." Lori pulled the note out of her bag and read the street number out loud. "That would be a little farther along," Andy said. "Near the cemetery, I think." He slowed the car as they drove closer to the Dean's number. "Right here," Sky said. "This should be the house." They stopped in front of a large gray Victorian mansion with gingerbread cutouts around its roofline, set back on a deep lawn. But when they got out of the car, they found no number or name to identify the owner of the house. "I'll check the house next door," Jim volunteered. He jogged over to inspect a similar Victorian. When he returned, he reported that that house, too, had no number and no identifying name on its mailbox. "It's got to be one of these," Sky said. "Let's split the raffle tickets," Andy suggested. "Good thinking," Sky said. "Lori and I will try this house, and you and Jim go next door." They separated at the curb. Andy tucked his tickets into the pocket of his cutoffs, and he and Jim started toward the driveway of their house. Lori smoothed out invisible wrinkles in her pale yellow slacks as she and Sky walked up the long drive to the house in front of them. She straightened the collar of her soft yellow and blue striped blouse. She fiddled with the gold chain belt at her waist and cleared her throat. "What are you so nervous about?" Sky asked, her voice quieter than usual. She was staring up at the old mansion that loomed before them. They mounted the steps to the front porch, and Lori rang the doorbell. They waited, both of them fidgeting, but the door remained closed. "No one's home," Sky whispered. "Let's go." "Why are you whispering?" Lori asked. "I'm not," Sky whispered again. "Oh, come on. I'm leaving." Lori cocked her head. "Wait a minute. Did you hear that?" She stepped back and looked up at the upper floors. There it is again. That sound. Like a cat or something. It came from inside. "I didn't hear anything," Sky said. The heavy stillness of Fear Street was getting to her, though, and she tugged at Lori's arm. "Let's get out of here." Just then, the door opened. Lori recognized the woman standing inside, holding the door slightly ajar. It was Miss Stine, the woman who had picked Toby up at the hospital. They had found the right house. Toby's mother stared out at them, a scowl on her face. She was wearing a baggy sweater over an equally baggy dress that was stained down the front. Wisps of frizzy bleached blonde hair straggled around her ears, and her pale eyes squinted suspiciously at the girls. She didn't seem to recognize Lori from the hospital. "Yes," she said darkly. "Hello," Sky began, her voice croaking. "I'm very busy. What do you want?" Miss Dean said. Lori stepped closer to the door. "We're student volunteers at Shadyside Hospital," she said, holding up the tickets in her hand. "We're selling raffle tickets for the construction fund there. You know, for the red Mercedes. They cost $1 each, and we wondered if you'd like to—" She ran the words together nervously. "Oh, for heaven's sake," Miss Dean said, annoyed. She glanced back over her shoulder into the house. Lori tried to peek inside, but Miss Stine was blocking her view, so Lori continued her appeal. "They're holding the drawing in September. It's a fabulous car, and a really good cause. Everyone in Shadyside is—" Okay. Miss Stine turned back to her. "How much?" $1 a ticket. I've got a full book if you want more." "One will do," Miss Stine said. "I'll have to get my purse." She moved away from the door, and Lori started to follow her inside. "No, wait here." She closed the door quickly in Lori's face. "Was that Toby's mother?" Skye asked. Lori nodded. Skye made a face. They waited in uncomfortable silence. The sky was darkening over Fear Street. Huge black clouds began to roll in, angry puffs that threatened to explode into lightning any minute. Skye began to shiver in her light t-shirt. She thrust her hands into the pockets of her jeans to warm them. "What's taking so long?" she complained. "Shh! Listen," Lori said. "Don't you hear that now?" An unmistakable sound floated out on the heavy air. A child sobbing, coming from somewhere deep inside the house. "I hear it," Skye said grimly. Lori couldn't stand it any more. She pushed open the door a bit and slid inside the Dean house, ignoring Skye's gasp behind her. The house was as chilly as the air outside. From what Lori could see, the downstairs was barely furnished. Only a few mismatched tables and chairs were scattered around on the uncarpeted floor of the 2 rooms that opened off the front hall. The stairs to the 2nd floor were steep and also uncarpeted. It was the coldest looking and feeling house Lori had ever been in, and the quietest, too. The crying had stopped now, and the silence was unnerving. She sneaked past the stairs and moved down the hall toward the back of the house to catch a glimpse of the kitchen. Dirty dishes and spilled food covered the corner of the table that she was able to see. She could only imagine what the rest of the kitchen must look like. Miss Stine was a slob, in person and in practice. Poor Toby, she thought. A faint noise sounded behind her. She wheeled around and stepped back. There, on the bottom step of the staircase, was the little boy, barefoot and wearing wrinkled pajamas a size too large. "Toby!" Lori cried happily. Her bright smile faded instantly. She was shocked to see him looking so awful, much paler, and maybe even a little thinner than when he had left the hospital that morning. What had happened to him in a few short hours? As Lori walked over to him, Toby took a hasty step back up the stairs. He stared at her, frightened. "Toby, it's Lori, from the hospital," she said. But Toby just took another step up the stairs away from her. He didn't respond, and he didn't seem to recognize her. "What's the matter, Toby? Don't you remember me?" she pleaded, holding out her hand to him. There was a sudden noisy clatter, and Miss Stine came flying down the stairs. She grabbed Toby's arm and shook him roughly, yelling at him. "You! I told you to stay in your room! Get up there!" She gave Toby a push. He slid past her, whimpering. His small legs pumped as he fled up the steep staircase and out of sight. Lori's jaw dropped, but she didn't get the chance to say anything. Miss Stine quickly turned her anger on Lori. "You've got a lot of nerve coming in here." She rushed to the door and flung it wide. "Here, just take this and get out." She thrust $1 at Lori, who was scrambling to tear a raffle ticket from her book. Miss Stine grabbed the ticket from her and shoved her out the door. With a loud bang, the door was slammed shut. "What happened in there?" Skye asked, as she and Lori rushed down the long drive to the car where Andy and Jim were waiting. "Tell me." Lori was almost too shaken to speak. Finally, she burst out breathlessly. "I saw Toby. He looks terrible, and scared to death. Something is not right in that house. I'm sure of it. The way that woman pushes him around and yells at him, something is not right." On the ride back, Lori sat silently, lost in troubled thought. She had gotten to see Toby again, but she was more upset than ever. The child's fear was directed at her. Why would he be so afraid of her? And even worse, why didn't Toby remember her?